Hey everybody, this is Tom Barnes in the Chicago scene talking about a legendary Chicagoan, John Prine. I'm here with Bruce Ritz Gilbert, and you kind of have that passion and that love of John Prine. You've been a fan of his for as long as you've seen him up in what, like up in Milwaukee? Is that where you kind of saw him, or Madison rather?
I did. Thanks, Tom, so much for having me on. And I
Yeah.
first saw John Prine in 1974. I'd heard him before that, but I first saw him in 1974 in Milwaukee at Summerfest, which many of your listeners may know.
Yeah, we know Summerfest.
Yep, and it was much smaller back then and not quite as sophisticated, but it was still a spectacular festival. And I saw John Prine in the summer of 1974.
From Summerfest up in Wisconsin to down here in Chicago, I fell in love with John Prine because of WXRT. I mean, they've played his music throughout his career, and it was a shock to hear that the man died because of COVID. You know, he had complications of COVID last year, and it was a shock to the music community, and I imagine his fans.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. It was, of course, the early days of COVID, so we didn't know that much about it. But John had some compromising health conditions. So in a way, it wasn't surprising that once he got COVID, that he died from it. It was, though, devastating, obviously, for his family. And many of us who were fans felt like a dear friend had died. It was just a very sad time. So many of us mourned in certain ways, and I did it by starting what we called the John Prine Album Club. I gathered my three daughters and four of my nephews and a couple of my brothers-in-law and a few other folks. And we decided to listen to every John Prine album, right from his very first one, John Prine, to the very last one, Tree of Forgiveness. And we did it week by week. So every week we had sort of our assignment was to listen to the album from front to back. And then we gathered by Zoom. Of course, it was the Zoom era, as it's
And
still
we're
is.
still in it.
We're still in it. And we gathered by Zoom, in our case, on Thursday nights, and we talked about each song on the record. A couple of us picked up our guitars and would play a song from the record. And it was really our way of honoring, remembering, and giving a tribute to John Prine.
And very much way almost like a grieving process. You know, people grieve in different ways, and it's not always what people seem to think it looks like. You know, I mean, obviously John Prine was a big influence in your life. You know, I mean, you remember the day you saw him up at Summerfest, and I'm sure you remember the day he passed. And I'm sure it made you smile a little bit that he won 2 Grammys in the last Grammys that just happened. And so much so that the impact he made, you decided, you know what, I'm going to write a book, because there just wasn't enough about him out there from what you were gathering when you were going through all this.
Well, that's right. As we were doing the John Prine Album Club, after a few weeks, it sort of became clear that I was the teacher and everyone else on the Zoom were the students, in large part because I had a much deeper history of John Prine. I knew a whole lot more about him, covered a couple of his songs that we recorded. So I started doing some pretty deep research into each album and each song. And I found there was some material out there. There was an unauthorized biography that was written in 2015. And there's a lot of things on the internet, you know, a review here and a review there and an article here and there. You know, there's a good bit, but there wasn't a lot all in one place.
Which is odd, right? Because I mean, John Prine it's a legend in music. How is that gone by, beloved by Bob Dylan, beloved by people that are in that circle, and no books about him? It's kind of nuts.
Well, again, there was the one, which is an unauthorized biography. And then John had his own book called Beyond Words, which he wrote in 2017, but it wasn't really a biography by any means. It was really a book that included some of his songs with some of the lyrics and some interesting pictures. So it was sort of like a coffee table book. But I thought that there was really room for putting a book together that discussed his songs. Fiona Prine said just a week or so ago on one of the early morning shows, everything that you ever wanted to know about John is in his songs. So I wrote a book about his songs, and it really does tell you a whole lot about John Prine and, of course, his music. And that was, I guess part of my grieving process, but I think it also will be helpful to John Prine fans. I think it will be confirming to those of you who know a whole lot about John Prine. And for those who know less about him, I think they'll find out a lot about him and hopefully listen to a whole lot more John Prine music.
Yeah, the man certainly wore his heart on his sleeve when it came to his lyrics and his writing with his music. But what was the thing that you found in this process that surprised you about John?
There were a number of things that I found in doing the research. Um, for example, there's a song that he did on an album that he did with a country singer named Mac Wiseman. Mac Wiseman's an old-time country bluegrass guy who was in his 80s when John and Mac did a record together. And they sang a bunch of old country standards, including a song called "I Forgot to Remember to Forget." Um, which is a really good song. But I had heard the album, but I had never really figured out what the song was about or the history of it. And it turns out it has a deep history, including it was recorded by Elvis Presley in 1955, and it amazingly was recorded by the Beatles in 1964. So you have a lineage,
Wow.
Elvis to the Beatles to John Prine and Mac Wiseman. So
That's
there are things like that that I found out about a whole lot of songs that John recorded.
I mean, you just mentioned Rock and Roll Hall of Fame material all
Yeah,
across the board. It's incredible.
that's right.
And I imagine these are a lot of these little anecdotes and little fun stories that you found that you put into this book that was just put out. What was it, March? Beginning, middle part of March, right?
It literally came out on March 19th. Um, Although again, the issue with that is it actually zoomed right up to I think it was #1 in new release in music reference on Amazon for a quick moment, and then Amazon sold out of the book. So right now, disappointingly, Amazon doesn't have any inventory, but they're getting it back in, so it will be back in soon. But the book is available on BookBaby. That's where I'm pushing people to get it. BookBaby's bookshop certainly has them, and you can get that through my website as well. There's a link to it there.
What's the website?
BruceRitzGilbert.com. And through that, you'll see a link to the BookBaby's bookshop. And I really tend to want to support BookBaby. It's a smaller bookshop, obviously considerably smaller than Amazon, since nothing is bigger than Amazon.
Right. Well, and they have the book, which is the most important thing,
That's
right?
right.
So,
Right.
and right before we wrap up, you were a lawyer before, and you've written things before, but this is your first dive into writing, and you didn't just write like a little prose here. You wrote a book about one of your musical heroes. I imagine that process was rewarding and terrifying all in one.
I think you described it well. When I started, after I had done a good bit of research through this John Prine Album Club, which we did, I was taking notes. And then one day in July last summer, I just said, I think this could be a book. I think there's something there. So I literally just started typing on my computer, and I went album by album, song by song, obviously doing a whole lot of research as I was writing. And a few months later, I had sort of the first draft of a manuscript, which obviously then I did a lot of work in editing and improving. And next thing you know, you got a 300-page book.
That's fantastic, Bruce. And for people who are looking for it, you mentioned the website. It's John Prine, One Song at a Time, available at
BookBaby's bookshop. And you can get a link to that if you have any trouble finding that through my website, which is bruceritzgilbert.com.
Pleasure talking to you, Bruce. Thank you very much for joining me.
Tom, thank you so much for having me.